This is David Barsamian, and I'm here at MIT with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics, author of numerous books, American Power and the New Mandarins, At War with Asia. His latest work is Hegemony or Survival. I was looking at the Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary in your office, and I looked up the definition for fairy tale, and it had two definitions. The first one, which is probably the most popular one, a story as for children involving fantastic forces and beings as fairies, wizards, and goblins. And then the second definition, a made-up story usually designed to mislead. I'd like to talk to you about fairy tales and empire. The doctrine, what I call the doctrine of good intentions, that occasionally U.S. policy is marred by the proverbial bad apples and tragic mistakes, but basically the record of goodness continues unimpeded.
Yeah. Well, the standard story in scholarship and media and so on is that there are two conflicting tendencies. One is what's called Wilsonian idealism, good intentions. The other is sober realism. We have to realize the limitations of our good intentions. Sometimes things can't be done properly. But that's it. That's the spectrum. And it's not just the United States. It's also you read it right now in the client states, like, say, take England. Probably the best newspaper in the world is the London Financial Times, pretty independent, so on and so forth. They have an article a few days ago by one of their leading columnists. They are critical of U.S. policy. They say the problem with U.S. policy is it is so dominated by Wilsonian idealism that the U.S. is getting into trouble. You need a few drops of sober realism to temper this passionate dedication to democracy and freedom and so on. And it goes on to say there can no longer be any doubt that George Bush and Tony Blair are motivated by their vision and faith in democracy and rights, and we know that because they have even said so. And that proves it. That's in fact the only evidence if you look. But we have to be more realistic and realize, for example, in the case of Iraq, that although, of course, Bush and Blair are just dedicated to what the Boston Globe calls Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq. And that's the leading liberal paper in the country and the paper of the liberal intellectuals. Although it's clear that we're dominated by that, we must understand that Iraqi culture may not be up to be able to rise to the heights that we have planned for them. In fact, if you, I mentioned that because I just read it a couple of days ago, but it's essentially universal. Take, say, the announcement of the Messianic vision, which was just about a year ago, to great fanfare and speech in Washington. What happened is that as the pretexts for the war collapsed, no weapons of mass destruction, no Al-Qaeda, all the pretexts, the Bush's speechwriters had to conjure up something new. And since the word vision has been associated with Bush as a matter of journalistic convention, this is, if you take a look back, ever since the Republican PR system started to work, and of course the media all accept it and commentators accept it, you can't mention Bush without talking about his vision for this, that, and the other thing. Maybe he's peering off into the distance in a photograph nearby or something. I've sometimes counted the word vision or dream, 10 or 15 times in an article in a sober, serious newspaper. So they conjured up his messianic vision to bring democracy to the Middle East. The commentators just fell all over themselves. The leading commentator of the Washington Post, David Ignatius, former editor, respected correspondent, just fell over in awe. He said, this proves that the Iraq War was the most noble war in history. The vision is led, he said, by the idealist in chief, Paul Wolfowitz, who has the most extreme record of passionate hatred of democracy of probably anybody in the administration, but it doesn't matter. He's the idealist in chief. The proof is that he, Ignatius, was with Wolfowitz when they went to the town of Hilla, and he talked about the Tocqueville. It also happens to be the town where the first major massacre occurred, but we'll put that aside, the American massacre. So that was one side. Then you go to the other side of the spectrum, the critics. There were plenty of critics. They say, yes, the vision is noble and inspiring, but we have to be more realistic. It's beyond our reach. The Iraqi culture is deficient, and so on. That's approximately the spectrum. And is there anything new about this? Nothing at all. In fact, you'd have to work hard to find a historical example that's different. Not just the United States or Britain, but France and Germany, including Hitler, Stalin, Japanese fascists. If we had records from Genghis Khan while he was massacring tens of millions of people, probably also had a noble vision. See if you can find an exception.
In fact, in The Responsibility of Intellectuals, in your essay in American Power and the New Mandarins, you quote Churchill talking to Stalin in Tehran in 1943. Churchill said, "The government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations who wished nothing more for themselves than what they had. If the world government were in the hand of hungry nations, there would always be danger. But none of us had any reason to seek for anything more. The peace would be kept by peoples who lived in their own way and were not ambitious. Our power placed us above the rest. We were like rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations."
Yeah. Churchill was pretty proud of that. It's part of his history of the war, his great history of the war. And he's to be praised for that. He's one of the rare exceptions who doesn't go on gushing about his noble vision all the time, but tells the truth occasionally, not always. There's plenty of gushing too. But in passages like that and elsewhere, he has essentially told the truth. We're the rich men. If you take a look at there's an important, I can't remember it verbatim, but right before the First World War, when he was in Parliament, or maybe he was minister of something or other, he informed Parliament that the Britain must greatly expand its military expenditures. And he goes on to say in Churchillian eloquence, which I can't duplicate from memory, that Britain has conquered a large part of the world. It's taken the riches of the world, not by peaceful means, by brutal and vicious means. So people don't like it and they hate us. But therefore we have to have more military force so we can maintain it. That's his speech to Parliament. He later published it about 20 years later, but he cut out all the offending statements. They were later discovered by one of his biographers, Clive Ponting, in his original records. But the original statement was pretty accurate. The doctored one was the standard messianic vision, which is, to my knowledge, universal or near. I have never come across any archival record, even among the worst monsters, who don't say that. Now, there are people who are honest, like Henry Kissinger. It's one of nice things about him. And the intellectual community and the media have to work to suppress these things because they don't sound nice. So, for example, just a couple of months ago, I think May.
Oh, yeah, we've talked about that.
How we talked about it? Well, it's a perfect example.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't find anything like it in the archival record, but it was suppressed. Yeah. Okay, call for genocide. And other times, too. I mean, when he, like in the national security strategy, he praised it, but he said it cannot be universalized. It's for us, right of aggression is for us. Okay, that's honesty. Good, that's the way you should talk. And the quote from Churchill is like that. But what you typically find is nobility of vision. I mean, the guys at the other end of the stick don't see it that way, but that you'd expect.
In At War with Asia, one of your earlier political books, which has just been reissued by AK Press, you talk about this. You say that the leaders of imperialist powers and their spokesmen have been able to persuade themselves and the domestic population, so long as the costs are not too high, of the benevolence and rationality of the measures they undertake to extend their power. And then you quote John Adams, "Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all his laws." And that's a remarkably candid statement from John Adams.
And the literature is peppered with them, was it Adams or Jefferson? Jefferson, maybe, who said that he trembles for this nation when he remembers that God is just and will punish it for its sins, which he knew. They were exterminating the native population. They were slavery and so on. And he trembled for the nation. So you can find statements like that. But by and large, people are called statesmen, political leaders. And also most of the intellectual classes go along with it.
Does it take any work to be delusional and repress reality? I'm looking here at another quote. You cite Ambassador Charles Bolin. I guess you could describe him as a kind of liberal mainstream. Yeah. In At War with Asia, talking about a post-war U.S. policy. And he says one of the difficulties of explaining the policy is that it is not rooted in any national material interest of the United States, as most foreign policies of other countries in the past have been.
That's completely standard. And you find the same in the archival record of just about any state. The French were carrying out a civilizing mission. Mussolini was nobly uplifting the Ethiopians. The Japanese, it brings tears to your eyes to read.
But the question was, do you see this as delusional, or they're actively repressing it? Well, that's not important.
First of all, we all do it. Every single one of us does it. Just think honestly about your own life. Have you ever done anything bad, ever?
Yeah. Not me, but let's say, I'll concede that. Yeah, but we don't have the power of life and death over others.
But in our own lives, we do it all the time. You steal a toy from your younger brother, your mother comes in and starts yelling at you, and you say, look, he stole it from me, and he didn't want it anyway, and so on and so forth. And after a couple of seconds, you believe it, yes, this is very easy. And if you happen to have your finger on the button, okay, it's also easy.
Again, I want to kind of frame the discussion between Vietnam, which is where you kind of came in to the scene in terms of public visibility, and Iraq, which is, of course, today. The cover of At War with Asia, the original cover, has a remarkable black and white photograph. Unfortunately, the new edition does not. It shows, why don't you describe it, and then we can...
maybe you can get a picture of it.
We can fast forward today. Well, it's a U.S. soldier.
Beefy soldier with a rope pulling a skinny, half-naked Vietnamese captive behind him. Yeah.
And we go fast forward to today, to Lindy England.
Yeah. The only difference is she's not a big, beefy soldier, but it's the same. And in fact, you go back to pictures of the conquest of where we're sitting right now, and it's also the same. And you go back to the ugliest periods of history, and yes, it's the same. That's a universal picture of unconstrained power against helpless victims, and presented with the utter nobility. Nobody anywhere near the mainstream could be more critical than John King Fairbank. Was really a critical opponent of the war and the dean of Asian scholarship. I just look at what he was saying. We entered Vietnam in an excess of benevolence, not paying attention to, if we'd only had more people who'd studied Chinese at Harvard, they would have told us that this isn't going to work, and our flood of magnanimous benevolence wouldn't succeed, and so on. Yeah, that's from the extreme left, or Anthony Lewis, tragic mistake, benevolent intentions to do good, and this comes out like boilerplate, and I'm sure the people believe it. I mean, and the things they believe are astonishing. I mean, on the death of Arafat, the press coverage was quite interesting. New York Times had a front page think piece, weekend review, by a very intelligent journalist. Actually, I know him. He's their intellectual, kind of almost house intellectual in the field. Pretty left liberal, I suspect, very smart. He starts off by saying the post-Arafat era is going to test the quintessential American faith that elections legitimate even the frailest of institutions. That's paragraph number 1 about the quintessential American faith, front page paragraph. You go down and you get to the final paragraph on the continuation page, where you usually do find interesting things. And he says, well, that there's only one example he discusses, Palestinians. So what's the example? He says, well, the United States was unwilling to accept elections among the Palestinians because they knew that Arafat was going to win and would get a stronger mandate, and besides, Hamas would probably get some credibility. So that tells you there's no connection made between the first paragraph and the last paragraph, but it explains it. Our quintessential faith is that elections are fine, democracy is wonderful, as long as it comes out the right way. Comes out the wrong way, well, can't do it. That's the quintessential faith. It was also the quintessential British faith and French faith and Stalin's faith in the people's democracies. Yeah, that's the quintessential faith. And in fact, it is illustrated not only in this example, dramatically, because it's one story, but in case after case. And it cannot be perceived, because if you perceive it, you know too much about yourself. And that's dangerous. You don't understand much about yourself. All kind of troubles follow from that, like you have to do something about what your own crimes. Well, it's easier to be comfortable and wealthy and privileged and respected. I don't suggest that it's deceit or dishonesty. It's just a natural development. The pressures to conform are very great. The consequences of honesty are often quite unpleasant.
November 29th, front page story in the New York Times, Shadow of Vietnam Falls Over Iraq River Raids, by John F. Burns. He writes, that war, Vietnam, is rarely mentioned among the American troops in Iraq, many of whom were not yet born when the last American combat units withdrew from Vietnam more than 30 years ago. A war that Americans did not win is considered a bad talisman among those men and women who privately admit to fears that this war could be lost.
First of all, as you know, I'm one of the few who doesn't agree that the U.S. lost the war. I agree with the business world back in the early 70s that the U.S. had already won the war and therefore should pull out because it's just getting too costly. And I think if you look at the internal planning documents, that's a very understandable position. U.S. won its major objectives. It didn't win its maximal objectives. That's a substantial victory. There's no way for a huge, powerful state to lose a war against a defenseless enemy. That just can't happen. So yes, they didn't get their final goals, but they got the major ones. And the major ones were serious. Those are the ones that hold throughout history, but certainly throughout the Cold War period. The major concern was back in the late 40s, but right into when Kennedy launched the full-scale war. The concern was that Vietnam, an independent Vietnam, could be successful in terms that would be meaningful to others nearby. Thailand, the rot might spread, as Acheson put it, as far as Indonesia, which was really important, had major resources, unlike Vietnam. That could lead Japan to accommodate to an independent Asia becoming its technological center, essentially recreating the New Order. It would mean that the U.S. had lost the Pacific War. They weren't ready to lose the Pacific War in 1950. And that was finished. By the time, by the mid-'60s, South Vietnam, which was the main target, had been virtually destroyed. And the chances that Vietnam would ever be a model for anything had essentially disappeared. We have to remember what was happening. Like this article talks about the Swift boats. And when were this, like John Kerry and the Swift boats? When and where was that? That was 1969, deep in the Mekong Delta, way in the south. That region had already been practically destroyed years before. The most respected military historian and Vietnam specialist, Bernard Fall, happened to be killed. He was pretty hawkish, incidentally. He's described as a dove, but he wasn't. He thought Saigon ought to rule in all of Indochina, all of Vietnam. By 1960, but he cared about the Vietnamese. By 1967, 2 years before Kerry was there, he said he wondered whether Vietnam would become extinct as a cultural and historical entity under the blows of the most massive military machine ever launched against an area this size. That was 2 years before the Kerry and the Swift boats. And he was in the area that had been most extensively attacked and devastated, way in the south. Nothing to do with Russia, China, in fact, nothing to do with North Vietnam, if that matters. And it doesn't matter, that's gone. In fact, I happened to watch, I don't usually watch television, but I was in a hotel somewhere and I watched something on CNN or one of those things where they had a forum of deep thinkers. I think it was run by Howard Kurtz, and they had a couple other major people. And it was called, the title was America's Vietnam Obsession. And it was talking about how the whole political campaign is overwhelmed by an obsession with Vietnam, and what's the reason for this, and there were all sorts of thoughtful commentaries and so on. The fact of the matter is Vietnam never even entered the campaign. Did anybody ever refer to what was going on in the country? Did anybody ever ask what John Kerry was doing there 7 years after Kennedy started bombing it and using chemical warfare and driving the population out? 2 years after Bernard Fall, who they all respect, thought it might become extinct? Nobody ever asked that, because the story has to be that we are benign, benevolent, and we made a mistake, and we lost because we didn't get our maximal goals. And anything outside of that is just unintelligible to an educated person. So yes, there's a Vietnam obsession if we totally ignore the Vietnam War. It would be like if Germany had survived the Second World War, and somebody worried about the fact that there too many bodies were found in Auschwitz or something at the very end, or something or other. They talk about Germany's Vietnam, Germany's Auschwitz obsession. It's not even, you don't know how to describe it. It's outlandish. In fact, by now it's gotten to the point where the New York Times is publishing on the front pages, without it concealing it, major war crimes, and describing them in the front page story as crimes for which the entire political leadership should face the death penalty under U.S. law, under the War Crimes Act passed by the 1996 Republican Congress. They're all liable for the death penalty for what the New York Times happily describes on the front pages.
That would be the November 8th issue of the Times of U.S. troops occupying the hospital in Fallujah.
Yeah, that's one of the first acts in the conquest of Fallujah, which is a major war crime, was to take over the general hospital. And they give a reason. The reason is the hospital was a propaganda weapon because it was producing inflated casualty figures. Well, first of all, how do we know they were inflated? Well, because our dear leader said so, so therefore they were inflated. But the idea that you conquer a hospital because it's publishing casualty figures, I mean, the Geneva Conventions could not be more clear. I mean, the wording says explicitly and clearly that under all circumstances, a medical facility must be protected by all parties to a conflict, and there can be no interference with it, and no medical personnel can be stopped from doing what they have to do, and so on. I mean, here they describe that the patients were kicked out of their beds, forced to lie on the floor, handcuffed. Doctors too. There's a picture of it with some, and what they are, and that's that is a really grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, and the U.S. War Crimes Act of 1996, passed by the Republicans, says that grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions are subject to the death penalty for the political leadership. Of course, they're not talking about the U.S., but the wording is explicit. So here we have a situation where the New York Times is in effect saying loudly and cheerfully on the front page that Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the rest should be facing the death penalty just for this one act. That's a tiny piece of it. I mean, the way they describe the destruction of Fallujah. I mean, I wish I had the resources to read the Russian press at the time of, say, Grozny.
In Chechnya.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. City about the same size, 400,000 people. They bombed it into dust and destroyed it. Fallujah is almost a duplicate. And that was considered a major war crime, rightly. But when we do it, it's liberation. A lot of, the embedded journalists are talking about the suffering of the Marines. It's their tanks. It's so hot, and they're getting shot at all over the place. And it's. I can't imagine that the Russian press was any worse, or for example, or for that matter, the Nazi press. Can you imagine it was any worse? It's hard to believe.
Well, the issue of civilians also has civilian deaths has really undergone some transformation comparing Vietnam and Iraq. It started in the first Gulf War when Powell, who was then chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said he wasn't interested in Iraqi body counts. That's been echoed again by Tommy Franks, who led this attack on Iraq, that, we don't do body counts. Nevertheless, The Lancet, a respected British medical journal, did do some research and came up with some rather startling numbers that did not seem to catch the attention of the mainstream press.
Barely mentioned. I mean, they came up with they did a careful study, which found that the most probable number of deaths due to the war is about 100,000. And they pointed out correctly it was a pretty conservative study. So in their study, they excluded the Anbar region, Fallujah, and the region around that, because there the deaths are much higher, and that would have, by extrapolation, greatly inflated the total. And they included the Kurdish regions where there was almost no fighting, so the deaths are very low. And for that and other reasons, the estimates are probably on the conservative side. It was mentioned in the United States, dismissed as just propaganda and all sorts of silly nonsense about how the statistics were wrong and so on, standard techniques of epidemiological studies. In Britain, there was a little more protest, and the government was forced to produce some utterly idiotic comments saying, well, the study isn't worth anything because it's based on extrapolation, like every other study that exists. So it's based on extrapolation, so it isn't worth much. And besides, the Iraqi ministry, what they call the Iraqi ministry, that is the ministry of the U.S. British-imposed client government, gives a much lower figure, so therefore it doesn't mean anything. But in England, at least, you had to discuss it a little idiotically, but at least discuss it. In the United States, it didn't matter. But what is new about this? I mean, take Vietnam. In the case of Vietnam, we literally do not know within millions what the casualties are, civilian casualties. within millions. I mean, the official estimates are around 2 million. On the actual estimate, probably around 4 million. Furthermore, nobody knows. There's been, as far as I know, only one study in the United States, public opinion study, carried out by a media institute at the UMass Amherst, Jolly's Institute, where they asked UMass Amherst students, who are pretty well educated, above the national average. They asked them to estimate the mean number and what they thought the number of Vietnamese casualties was. The mean, like half above, half below, was 100,000. I mean, that's as if that's like about 5% of the official figure. It's as if in Germany, you asked people how many Jews were killed in the Second World War, and they said 200,000 or something. We think there's a problem in German universities if that's what German university students are thinking. Here, it's understandable because it was never discussed. I mean, how many victims of chemical warfare were there? The chemical warfare that Kennedy started in 1962 to destroy food crops, so as and cover, so as there wouldn't be any indigenous support for the guerrillas. Yeah, I mean, there's some of the most carcinogenic elements that are known, dioxin. I mean, there has been intensive study of the effect on American troops, which was, first the Pentagon denied it, now they accept it, and yes, it was severe among American troops. And what about the people who are being dosed with it? Actually, there have been some studies, not here. Like there's a major study in Canada by Hatfield Associates. And in fact, some leading U.S. Public health figures of various universities have investigated it. I mean, they've found a dosage of Agent Orange, the dioxin-carrying chemical, which are hundreds of times as high as anything permitted anywhere in the West. And they have also correlated it with cancer, deformed fetuses, children without arms and brains and so on. And yeah, very close correlation. Nobody really knows the numbers, but the rough estimates are maybe 500,000, 1 million, just from chemical warfare. Now, here you have a striking test because it was only used in the South. They got the same genes in the North. No deaths in the North. You don't find in Hanoi Hospital, it's not full of jars with deformed fetuses. Saigon Hospital, it is. Actually, that's been pointed out. The New York Times science editor, I think it was Barbara Cressett, had an article on it about 10 years ago saying, really making a mistake by not studying this. I mean, here's a perfect test. We could learn a lot that would be useful for ourselves if we did a serious study of the difference between the birth deformities, the cancer, and so on in South Vietnam and in North Vietnam. That's the only question that comes up. Can we learn something about our crimes that would be useful for ourselves? Nothing else. And that's a rare comment on it. And so it continues. If you take a look at the Japanese literature today in Japanese, there are books coming out, detailed scholarly books, tons of footnotes, saying there never was a Nanjing massacre, sort of proving it to their satisfaction. Only a couple 100,000 people slaughtered. Is it any difference? I mean, the difference is that the Japanese were defeated, so it's not the standard line. It's a kind of a marginal line, and people object to it. Here, the U.S. won, like it always does, so therefore it's the standard line.
Just to clarify, in that November 8th article on the attack on the Fallujah hospital, the Times reporter Richard Opel doesn't mention the 1996 War Crimes Act that was passed. Yeah.
He doesn't, and there's a background there. The new Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, was President Bush's legal counsel, and as is known, he transmitted to Bush the conclusion of the Justice Department that Bush has the constitutional right to effectively rescind the Geneva Conventions. This was in the case of torture in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib.
I think he used the terms quaint and obsolete to describe that.
That was his word, but the conclusion was the president has the constitutional authority not to follow the Geneva Conventions in the time of war, rescind them in effect. But then he went on to say something else. he advised, you read the memorandum, he advised the president that this would be a good idea to rescind them because it would reduce the likelihood of criminal prosecution under U.S. law, referring to the War Crimes Act of 1996. So he said, yeah, good idea to do it. And he happened to be talking about torture, but it applies here. It's a good idea to rescind the Geneva Conventions, given the fact that the War Crimes Act does make the president not only liable for sentencing, but subject to the death penalty. So yeah, good idea to rescind it. Now that's what the headline should have been if there were newspapers.
A couple of other things around Fallujah that I'd like you to comment on. Reports that civilians trying to flee the city were turned back by U.S. forces. Okay, I'd like you to clarify that. And then the other thing is that a Red Crescent, Iraqi Red Crescent, which is their equivalent to the Red Cross, was attempting to deliver medical supplies to the besieged and injured, wounded there, and they too were turned back. So you want to clarify?
Well, what apparently happened, judging by the embedded reporters, is that if civilians were allowed to flee, if managed to flee, most of the city was blocked off. But if they managed to flee, they were allowed out, except for men. Men were turned back. Men of roughly military age were turned back. Well, we remember what that is. That's Srebrenica. That's exactly what's called, almost universally called genocide in the West. We know a lot about Srebrenica. There's a detailed Dutch government report. Dutch were the troops there and other sources, and it's pretty clear what happened. Srebrenica was a very lightly protected, underprotected Serb enclave, a Muslim enclave in Serbian territory. It was being used as a base for attacking nearby Serbian villages. Then they'd flee back into the protected area. It was clear that there was going to be a response, and the response was horrendous. But the response was, when the Serbians attacked, they trucked out the women and children, put them in trucks, took them out. They made the men stay, and they went in and killed the men. That sound familiar? Yeah, that's Fallujah. If the women, except the only difference is the U.S. bombed them out, didn't truck them out. The bombing had been going on for a month. So they bombed out the civilians. Women and children were allowed to leave. Men were stopped if they were found, sent back. They're supposed to be killed. That's universally called genocide here, when the Serbs do it. When we do it, it's liberation.
The New York Times, again on November 13th, has a report on page 8 on the Geneva Conventions. And it says, the headline is, it's a small article by Michael Janowski, rights experts see possibility of a war crime. Again, it's one of those kind of ping-pong, they say, I'll read you the exact language. Human rights experts said Friday that American soldiers might have committed a war crime on Thursday when they sent fleeing Iraqi civilians back into Fallujah. And then they quote a Defense Department spokesperson who says, our forces are, operating under law. The Marine commander of Fallujah, who claimed that there were no civilian casualties, incidentally, as late as November 20th, his name is Lieutenant General John Sattler, said on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer that the U.S. strictly adheres to the rules of law, the rules of war.
Well, the people responsible are not the soldiers or even the Marine commander. It's the people sitting in the White House. And there's no, as you say, there's no question about grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and what is mentioned there is the least of them. Yes, that's a violation of the rules of law, but it's not an explicit violation of the clear and crucial wording of the conventions, as in the General Hospital case. Which is incidentally only one. They also destroyed another hospital. But it's the civilian leadership. You go back to, say, Nuremberg. Who did they try? Like the German foreign minister was hanged because he had some role in what was called the supreme international crime that encompasses all the evil that follows. That's the wording. The supreme international crime is aggression. Okay, so since the German foreign minister was indirectly involved in aggression, he was hanged because of all the evil that followed, of which there was plenty. And the same is true here. So even the war crimes in Fallujah are minor. I mean, they're just encompassed. That's part of the evil that's encompassed in the supreme international crime. It's kind of interesting the way this is treated. I mean, the one case that's heralded, everybody talks about all over the world, is a Marine who kind of lost it in the middle of combat and killed a wounded Iraqi. So that's all over the place. I mean, how could Americans sink to such depths, Yeah, it's a crime. I mean, this guy probably didn't know what he was doing. Some friend of his just had his head blown off and he blew it and he committed a crime. Yes, true. Like some minuscule footnote. You wouldn't, in a history of the Second World War, you wouldn't even read it. It's so minuscule. But here we blow it up as a way of suppressing the real crimes. Very much the same as My Lai. I mean, My Lai was a minor footnote. It was part of a major military operation, Operation Wheeler Wallowa, which was directed by guys just like us, ties and jackets, sitting in air-conditioned offices, targeting B-52 raids on villages. That one operation, that's when Kerry was in Vietnam, incidentally. It's 1969 when the massacres peaked. This is one of the many operations which murdered who knows how many people, but in one particular spot, some uneducated, poor GIs in the field who didn't know who was going to shoot at them next and were scared out of their wits. Maybe it's that grandmother over there who's going to throw a grenade at us. They too lost it and they killed a couple hundred people. All right, that's the crime. And the criterion is they're not like us. I mean, it's just like when some enemy commits crimes. You get poor, uneducated people who are in the midst of conflict and have every reason to be scared out of their wits. If they commit a crime, that's horrible. If nice, educated folk like us, sitting in comfort and protection, commit massive crimes, in particular ordering these crimes, that doesn't matter. That's not the way Nuremberg worked. It worked the opposite way. They didn't go after the soldiers in the field. They went after the civilian commanders.
The Toledo Blade, not exactly the LA Times, the New York Times, or the Washington Post in terms of resources, produced a remarkable study which was honored by the journalistic craft. It won a Pulitzer Prize, a study of the Tiger Force, a platoon created part of the 101st Airborne that in 1967 was sent to the Central Highlands, which committed just one atrocity after another. I mean, it makes for chilling reading. Now,
missing the point, however.
Missing the point.
Yeah, it's missing the point. Yes, these soldiers committed atrocities, but 1967 was the year when Bernard Fall published his conclusions that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity might become extinct under the blows of the most massive military machine ever unleashed against an area this size by nice folks sitting in Washington. Okay, take a look at the comparison of the crimes. I mean, yes, what that platoon did is atrocious, but what about what the guys from Harvard and MIT sitting in Washington were doing when they were planning it, and planning actions which would lead to extinction of the country, and mainly South Vietnam, because that was the main target of the attack. I mean, in comparison, it doesn't exist. Actually, in this book, At War with Asia, there's a chapter which it's about My Lai. It used the term that was first used, Pinkfield, that was what it was called at first. And I agreed to write, it was written for the New York Review, I was still writing for them then. I agreed to write it when I was asked, but only on condition that I'd barely mention it. And if you read the chapter, it's barely mentioned. The chapter is about the other crimes going on, much worse, directed right from Washington. Those are the real crimes, not the soldiers in the field. Yes, that's criminal too. Their commanders are ordering crimes, but that's way down the chain of command. The chain of command starts with the civilians sitting in Washington. That's the people who were charged at Nuremberg and at Tokyo. And if we were even willing to be minimally honest, that's who'd be charged here, along with everybody who writes about the benevolence and the benign intentions and the mistake and everything else, trying to cover it up.
You have not been in favor of an all-volunteer army. Why not?
Well, as you know, I was very active in resistance in the 60s, organizing resistances. Barely. So the only reason I escaped the long jail sentence is because the Tet Offensive came along and the government called off the trials. And I was very involved, but I was never against the draft. And I'm not against it now. If there's going to be an army, I think it should be a citizens' army, not a mercenary army. Now, there are several kinds of mercenary armies, like there's the French Foreign Legion, or the Gurkhas, where the imperial power just organizes a mercenary army. Or there's another kind, it's called a volunteer army, which is in effect a mercenary army of the disadvantaged. People like us don't volunteer for it, except occasional maniacs. But people like, what's her name, England, they do volunteer, because they come from a background where that's their only chance. So yeah, they volunteer. So you end up getting a mercenary army of the disadvantaged overwhelmingly. And that's much more dangerous than a citizens' army.
But it was the citizens' army in Vietnam, in the Tiger Force unit.
It did. But in fact, take a look at the history of Vietnam. The U.S. committed a major error, the U.S. command. It did use the citizens' army to fight a vicious, brutal colonial war. And that can work for a while, but not for too long. I mean, right around that time, soldiers started disobeying orders, fragging their officers, getting doped up. I mean, the army was falling apart. In fact, that's part of the reason why the top brass wanted them out. You go back and you read the top, military analysts at the time from inside the Pentagon. They were saying, look, we got to get that army out of there, or else we're not going to have an army, because it's just collapsing from within. I mean, a citizens' army has ties to the citizen culture, and we know what was happening in the 60s. These are the same kids who were, protesting against the war by the late 60s. I mean, even at home, the protest didn't really begin until that time. It was around 1967 you started getting large-scale protests after 5 years of war and silence. But by that time, late 60s, when it was part of the whole youth culture that was developing, a kind of rebellious culture in many respects, and civilizing in many respects, that spilled over to the military, and it helped undermine the military, which is a very good thing. That's why no imperial power had ever used a citizens' army to fight an imperial war. You take a look at the British in India, French in West Africa, or, South Africans in Angola and so on. I mean, they didn't use, somewhat, but mostly they relied essentially on mercenaries, which makes sense. They can become trained killers. People who are too close to the civilian society can maybe do it up to a point, but aren't really going to be good at it. And pretty soon after that, like say by 1969, about 70% of the population in the United States described the war in the words that were used, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. That's 70% of the population. And that's about the time when at the extreme critical end, say Anthony Lewis, you started getting timid whispers about how it was a mistake. That's when 70% of the population were saying it's not a mistake, it's fundamentally wrong and immoral. Actually, what they meant by that, we don't actually know, because the people who carry out the polls don't ask the next question, probably because they're afraid of the answer. And they give an interpretation, which is that what they meant was there are too many American casualties. Well, maybe, but that's not the obvious interpretation of that comment. And that incidentally continues up to the most recent polls. In fact, the most recent polls are just astonishing. Major polls came out right before the last election, November 2004, and the results were so astonishing the press couldn't even cover them, couldn't even report them. I mean, they were produced for the elections, but there's scarcely a mention of them. In fact, I only found one of the major ones. I found no references. I mean, I don't do a complete search, but the other.
Why is that?
Because of their results.
Which were?
Well, for example, these are by the most prestigious polling organizations in the country: Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, Program on International Policy Attitudes, the University of Maryland. They really do careful work and regular work. So what you find is large majority of the population, I think, are in favor of signing the Kyoto Protocol, accepting the International Criminal Court, relying on the UN to take the lead in international crises. A majority are even in favor of giving up the Security Council veto when it comes to what's called preemptive war, which is meaning it's now interpreted as the right of aggression. Population is very strongly opposed. That's a bipartisan consensus. Both parties are in favor of it. Articulate opinion is almost entirely in favor of it with various qualifications. You got to make sure it doesn't cost too much and so on. A large majority of the population are against it and take the position that you're allowed to use force under pretty much the terms of the UN Charter. Probably people never heard of the UN Charter, but the answers to the questions that they give are pretty much the standard narrow interpretation of the Charter. You can use force if you're attacked or if there's an imminent threat of attack, like, planes flying across the Atlantic to bomb the United States. Okay, you can shoot them down. That's imminent threat of attack. That's what most of the population says. In fact, now, when you get to the Iraq War, it's quite interesting. About 75% say the United States should not have attacked Iraq if it did not have weapons of mass destruction or ties to al-Qaeda. 50% say, roughly, that we should have attacked Iraq. Now, that's after the government-sponsored reports, Kay, Dilfer, and so on, showing as definitively as you can that there were no weapons of mass destruction or programs and that there were no ties to al-Qaeda. Okay, how do you account for that? Well, people believe the propaganda, even after it was disproven. There's been enough of a barrage of government media propaganda so that people who don't have the time or energy or education or whatever to carry out individual research projects and really read the reports and so on, and just, go by the headlines or, television news or something, about half the population believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction or programs that were developing them, ties to al-Qaeda, a high percentage, forget the numbers, still think it was tied to 9/11 and so on. So yeah, they support the war, even though they are opposed to war, unless we're under imminent threat of attack, and in this case, unless Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda, meaning what that means is involved in 9/11. In fact, if you look at the interviews of people with, like England, the torturers in Abu Ghraib and so on, there were some interviews with them. Most of them say, we're taking revenge for 9/11. They did it to us. Why shouldn't we do it to them?
We've run out of time. Thanks very much, Noam Chomsky.
Okay. Yep.